Ministerio de Turismo y Deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres y Género y Diversidad, afuera. Ministerio de Obras Públicas, afuera. Aunque te resistas.
Afuera! 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 Honestly, this is probably one of the greatest catchphrases in political history, coming from a figure that should go down and hopefully will go down as the savior of Argentina. Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Sean, and I have been monitoring the situation in Argentina for a very long time behind the scenes, looking forward to making a video about Javier Milei, his rise to power, and of course, the character of the Argentinian people to actually deal with and embrace deep cuts to government spending as a solution for their long-term economic woes. And this is what we're going to talk about today. The man that has been wrongly labeled Argentina's Trump, that has been castigated by the media as Argentina's destroyer, who in reality is proving that libertarianism can actually work. Deep spending cuts actually can be sold to a certain population. They just need about 80 years of basically a form of socialism in order to prime them for the great change that we see in the nation of Argentina. But before we get into this, I want to say thank you to everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
Now, to understand Javier Milei's rise to power, and of course to understand why he's gained in popularity post-cutting spending and government jobs, you need to understand what existed before in Argentina. Now, a lot of people know the story of Argentina being one of the wealthiest countries in the world up until the Great Depression, but the part of the story that I want to focus on actually happens after that part, when Argentina embraced an ideology that is called Peronism or Peronism or Peronism, as I would like to call it, but that's definitely not how it was pronounced, where they basically instituted a bunch of different socialist policies. But of course, the internet will tell you that it's not quite socialism because there was also a nationalistic element to it. But stop me if you've heard this one before. They nationalized a bunch of industries. There's definitely a lot of price fixing. There's a lot of protections for workers that make it more difficult for them to be fired. And essentially, you have a bunch of government bureaucrats overspending for decades in the nation of Argentina, controlling an ever-increasing amount of the economy, and that is leading to ruination. Again, not quite socialism according to the AI definition, but in reality, it carries the most horrible elements of a socialist government. And of course, this has led Argentina to suffer through a ton of recessions, a ton of political turmoil, and of course, rampant inflation. Again, inflation in numbers that would be absolutely horrifying to the American people if we experienced just 10% of that, but Argentina was experiencing it on a monthly basis, and this set the stage for a libertarian so-called radical to come into office and tell the people what they needed to hear, which is government spending needed to be cut. And not baby cuts like we do in the United States, where we have all the spending up front and we say within 10 years we're going to reduce spending in these certain categories, only for it to be undone because one Congress cannot bind a future Congress. We're talking real legitimate cuts, and Argentina really went for it under Milei. Again, early on, he promised to get rid of a bunch of different government departments. Now, Republicans in the United States of America have been promising to get rid of the Department of Education since 1980, and all they've done basically since that time is expand spending on the Department of Education. However, Argentina's president, Javier Milei, did just that. He got rid of about half of the government departments in the state of Argentina. He also privatized a bunch of industries because Argentina is very resource rich with oil and other things that can be mined out of their country, and yet they weren't really producing anything. And of course, this ended up driving Argentina into a recession. They had a huge rise in poverty that is documented by a bunch of left-wing progressives. It went over 50% from around 45%, and a lot of people were saying, oh my god, it's absolutely failing. We warned you, Argentina's Trump is an absolute disaster. But here's the amazing thing about the nation of Argentina and the character of its people and the mindset that basically 80 years of a nearly uninterrupted socialism had put them in. They were ready for it. They were promised and told up front that the economy was going to get worse before it got better. And amazingly, Javier Milei maintained his popularity as poverty rose, as spending was frozen, and of course, as the recession ended up kicking in. And it's absolutely insane to think of in the context of the United States of America, where we have President Trump promising to solve pricing and all these problems on day one, that somebody could run for office, get 56% of the vote, promising that what he's going to do is initially drive us into a recession and then ultimately come through during the worst parts of said recession, not losing any popularity, and in certain polls gaining popularity. And in fact, this Bloomberg segment from 11 months ago, before things started to turn around, really gives you an indication of the mindset of the people of Argentina, who had to pay some higher prices, who actually had to have their contracts frozen, and I find it fascinating.
Low and middle class households who previously had to pay next to nothing, about 5% for the actual cost of electricity, are now having to pay between 20 and 30% of the real cost of that electricity.
This had real financial consequences for people like Mónica Pérez. She owns a carniceria in a working-class neighborhood outside of Buenos Aires, but she says she stands by her vote for Milei.
I love that he isn't a traditional politician. We got used to paying 2 pennies for electricity, 2 pennies for gas. Milei has now come to take all that away, which I think is good. But salaries have to recover as
Milei
well.
also cut real spending on pensions, social security, public wages, and education, and halved the number of ministries in government.
Now again, the setup for this, the prelude for this, is that this woman used to get very heavily subsidized electricity, very heavily subsidized other things, and guess what? She is having to start to pay the actual cost of those things under Milei, and yet she is unshaken in her vote, and yet she is undeterred because she understands that getting everything for free is not dignified, and if she has to pay a little bit more upfront in order for the correction to happen, that is a sacrifice she is willing to make. Again, show me the American that actually would buy into this message and not break faith. Show me the American that had been beaten down so much by socialism that they'd accept cuts in their short-term prosperity in order to have a promise of long-term prosperity for the nation. And by the way, Buenos Aires is also an excellent example of Milei's policies, completely bucking the progressive orthodox that we see, by the way, in the United States of America. Because while we have Mamdani, who won the Democratic primary in the city of New York, and politicians in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and a bunch of progressive advocates advocating for rent control or rent stabilization, in Argentina, Javier Milei got rid of these programs. And the reason why he got rid of these programs is because he knew, and I'm not going to say he believed, I'm going to say he knew, because we all know based on the data that these programs actually depress the supply of housing. They end up benefiting certain people in certain areas who happen to get one of these apartments, but the rest of the population ends up having to deal with exploding rents. And what ended up happening as a result of getting rid of these policies? Guess what? Housing supply in Buenos Aires went up 300%, but rents, they didn't skyrocket. They actually dropped due to the surge in supply by 40%. So again, we find out that libertarian ideas, economic freedom, actually works. And by the way, that woman on the streets with her small business talking about how, yeah, they used to basically have everything subsidized and now they're paying more and it hurts more now, is not alone. They actually interviewed a contractor for the government that had his contract frozen and has not been paid by the government, nearly done completing the work on this particular building, and he had a similar attitude about it. This is a public works building that was finished 6 months ago. We can't just hand it over. We can't deliver it yet because the government hasn't reactivated public work. If they don't certify and they don't pay, we cannot hand it over.
Juan Pablo Rudoni owns Ecosan, a modular construction company that works on both private and public infrastructure projects. Since Milei came to power, He says government contracts have been completely frozen.
Now, by the way, I'm reading the subtitles because we have podcast listeners that aren't going to be able to understand the language, but you would think a guy like this that had been working on this building, put his own money into it, and hasn't been paid by the government would be enraged with Javier Milei. Again, these are the people that Javier Milei sometimes calls or refers to as the parasite class that are sucking all the wealth out of Argentina, and the reason why he did a 90% cut in real terms in public spending and froze all manner of projects, no matter what level or how close they were to completion, in order to basically save the Argentinian economy. The expectation was the austerity wasn't going to be this harsh, that we weren't going to have a complete stop to public works. It's part of the cost we're all willing to take on in order to have a more normalized Argentina with the future. Again, these are the people being featured in this Bloomberg piece, and typically American outlets are incredibly critical of the politicians that they label this country's Trump or that country's Trump, and yet they find people that are negatively impacted by Milei's policies, and they say, you know what, we were not even expecting it to be this harsh. Obviously, this guy wishes that he would have been paid personally, but he says it's a part of the cost that they're willing to pay in order for Argentina to have a future. And honestly, I can't believe that I'm hearing people that actually make money off of these government contracts that have been secured by the government in so many respects actually say the greater good of our nation is what matters. And this is what's happening. And the irony of a libertarian, somebody obsessed with individual freedom, inspiring such national unity on these particular issues is absolutely unbelievable. It's so ridiculous. I can't even believe what I'm watching. And again, the proof of the pudding is in the taste. And while Argentina's poverty numbers, like I told you earlier on, went up north of 50% from around 40 to 45%, guess what? They have now fallen. Milei's promises have now paid due. The recession that he said was going to happen, they're out of it right now. And guess what? Poverty is now lower than when he took office at 38%. Still pretty high, but considering where Argentina started and the level of shock therapy that Milei ended up implementing, it's actually something that people did not remotely expect to happen this quickly. And this is because Argentina has drawn in a bunch of foreign investors in order to get into the mining industry, in order to produce oil, so that Argentina's natural resources don't languish in the ground anymore and actually start to produce wealth to start to build up their society. And a recent Sky News segment from a couple of days ago tells us about how consumer spending is up. Argentinians are buying more automobiles, and of course, inflation is lower than in the United States of America.
Milei has done what other world leaders have tried and failed to do. Under his leadership, inflation has dropped from a whopping 12.8% in 2023 to just 1.5% in 2024. Milei's deep spending cuts all but halted the economy in 2024 to get inflation under control, but this year has been a different story. Economic growth has punctuated Milei's leadership this year, with Argentina experiencing 3 consecutive quarters of economic growth. The economic resurgence is also being felt in the streets, with Argentinians holidaying more, enjoying leisure activities and spending their money on discretionary items, like cars, which has seen an 84% increase in purchases in the first few months of 2025. Real estate sales have also soared by 66% this year.
The story of Argentina is not concluded, and maybe in the future, if this doesn't work out, if this path ends up being flawed, you know what? At least we will learn what happens when an actual libertarian is given power, is given additional powers in that he got emergency powers after he took office to implement his vision. Now, we've seen in the nation of Chile, they embraced a lot of free market economists in the 80s, and Chile became one of the wealthier nations in Latin America as a response. So I think that we are going to see something similar in the nation of Argentina, although I have to point out, even though I thought that this plan would in fact work, I didn't think it would work this quickly, and I did fear that he would try to do too much too quickly, and that would lead to a disaster that would undermine his political capital. But in reality, the Argentine people, these people are on board. They're legitimate. They're the genuine article. They actually understand the problems far more than we do in the United States of America, and they're willing to fight back against these ridiculous protests and all this nonsense that cropped up in order to make it seem like Javier Milei was losing popularity, even though he was doing exactly what he promised. If only other nations could have a leader so honest and so bold as Javier Milei. And make no mistake about it, he is in no way, shape, or form Argentina's Trump. He is his own unique thing, much in the same way that Bukele in El Salvador is his own unique thing that is also addressing the specific problems of his nation. Now, in videos on El Salvador, we talked about how their main issue, their primary issue, was crime and the gangs, and how Bukele using mass incarceration solved that problem. But obviously, the issue in Argentina is spending, and he is correcting that issue, and hopefully prosperity is in the future for Argentines going forward. Again, libertarian policies working out, proving to be true, bucking progressivism, bucking Peronism, which of course is a form of socialism, and proving to benefit all of the people of Argentina. Now look, I'm gonna link some sources where you can read up on what's going on in the nation of Argentina, but as for me right now, this is where I'm gonna leave it. It's all I have for you today, so if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Javier Milei, the savior of Argentina, the guy who looks like one of the Beatles. Till next time.